In the shadowy depths of a Virginia estate, a family's darkest secret was unearthed. 47 children chained in a basement that would forever haunt American history. The Sullivan name, once respected throughout the county, became synonymous with unimaginable horror when authorities discovered what lay beneath their grand plantation home in 1834. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. March of 1834 arrived in Millbrook, Virginia, with a lingering, syrupy scent that clung to the misty hills. The morning dew glistened on the vast cornfields of the Sullivan family farm, where pristine rows stretched toward the horizon like nature's cathedral. Nobody in town suspected that beneath those fertile grounds, something unspeakable was festering just out of sight. Sheriff John Smith adjusted his worn leather hat as he made his morning rounds through the sleepy community. At 45, the lines around his eyes had deepened with each passing season. For 15 years, he had safeguarded Millbrook with unwavering dedication, his faith in human decency as solid as the old church bell that rang every Sunday morning. "Morning, Sheriff," called Thomas Miller from his porch. The farmer's weathered face creased with a smile, though his eyes betrayed a hint of unease. "Thomas," John nodded respectfully. "Everything all right at your place?" The farmer hesitated. "Been hearing things, strange noises coming from the Sullivan property at night. Probably nothing." This wasn't the first such comment John had heard in recent weeks. Whispers about missing children had begun to circulate through town like autumn leaves caught in a breeze. Most dismissed them as tall tales, but the rumors persisted. "I'll look into it," the sheriff promised, though doubt clouded his mind. The Sullivan family stood as pillars of the community. Constance Sullivan, with her charitable donations and Sunday school teachings, commanded respect from everyone in Millbrook. Her husband's agricultural innovations had brought prosperity to the region. They were beyond reproach in most eyes, including John's. As he continued his patrol, Sheriff Smith passed Reverend Michael Brown outside the whitewashed church. The men exchanged pleasantries, but John noticed how the Reverend's gaze drifted toward the Sullivan property on the hill. "Something troubling you, Reverend?" John asked. "Just prayers for all God's children," Michael answered cryptically. Later that evening, alone in his modest home, Sheriff Smith unfolded a crude map of Millbrook. He marked each location where children had reportedly gone missing over the past 3 years. A pattern emerged that he had subconsciously avoided seeing, all within walking distance of the Sullivan farm. A gnawing sense of guilt began to eat at him as he traced the pattern with his finger. Had he ignored the signs for too long? Had his respect for the Sullivan name blinded him to something sinister? The sheriff blew out his candle. But sleep remained elusive as whispered rumors echoed in his mind. The late winter storm of March 1834 descended upon Millbrook with a vengeance, turning roads into treacherous mud pits and forcing travelers to seek immediate shelter. Robert Davis, a merchant from Richmond passing through on business, found himself stranded as lightning split the darkening sky. The Sullivan family's grand white farmhouse stood as a beacon on the hill, its windows glowing with warm invitation against the violent weather. Martha Sullivan herself answered his desperate knocking, her silk dress and perfect posture betraying none of the farmhouse's secrets. "We always have room for those in need," she assured him, though her smile never quite reached her eyes. The merchant was shown to a modest guest room on the second floor, directly above what he was told was the family's root cellar. That night, as rain lashed against the window panes and thunder rolled across the Virginia hills, Robert awoke to sounds that couldn't be explained by the storm. Muffled whimpers and soft crying seemed to rise through the floorboards beneath his bed. He pressed his ear to the wooden planks, his heart racing as he distinctly heard chains rattling and what sounded like a child's hushed plea. Come morning, the merchant made his excuses and hurried into town. The comfortable bed and generous breakfast doing nothing to settle his unease. He sought out Reverend Michael Brown at the white-steepled church, hoping to confide his concerns to a trusted community leader. "The Sullivans have been pillars of this community for 3 generations, the Reverend assured him, his weathered face creasing with a dismissive smile. "Their charity work with orphaned children is well documented. Perhaps you heard the wind in the root cellar. Or maybe one of their adopted charges having a nightmare." Robert shifted uncomfortably on the hard wooden pew. "It sounded like more than one child, Reverend, and there was a distinct sound of metal, like chains." The religious leader's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Davis, I've personally blessed their charitable endeavors. The family regularly donates to our church and has helped countless unfortunate children find purpose through honest work." Though the traveler pressed his case, describing the sounds in greater detail, his concerns were politely but firmly dismissed. As he prepared to continue his journey the following day, Robert noticed how the townspeople averted their eyes when he mentioned the Sullivan estate. The seed of suspicion had been planted in his mind. Yet Millbrook's soil seemed deliberately infertile for such thoughts. What Robert couldn't know was that his brief stay would later be recorded in Sheriff John Smith's investigation notes as the first documented report of what lay beneath the Sullivan family's immaculate floorboards. The disappearance of Maria Garcia spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The 13-year-old immigrant had been taken in by the Sullivan family just 3 days prior. After arriving alone from Mexico with nothing but a small cloth bundle of possessions, Constance Sullivan had made quite a show of Christian charity at Sunday service, announcing to the congregation how she and her husband would provide shelter for the poor foreign child until proper arrangements could be made. By Wednesday, Maria was gone. "Children that age are flighty, especially the foreign ones," Constance explained to the small gathering at the general store. "Oh, probably homesick and wandered off. She'll turn up or she won't," she shrugged, adjusting her bonnet with manicured fingers. "The Lord gives and takes as he sees fit." Sheriff John Smith nodded along with the others, though something in Constance's casual dismissal troubled him. Still, with no evidence of foul play and the girl having no known relations in town, there was little he could officially do. The townsfolk quickly accepted the explanation. After all, the Sullivans were pillars of the community, generous donors to the church, and hosts of Millbrook's finest social gatherings. Thomas Miller had been delivering sacks of grain to the Sullivan farm when he first heard it, a sound so faint he nearly convinced himself it was just the March wind whistling through the barn boards. The farmer paused, setting down his load near the cellar doors. There it was again, a whimper, followed by what sounded like metal scraping against stone. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The sound haunted him, mingling with rumors of other children who had briefly appeared in Millbrook only to vanish without explanation. His wife, Sarah, noticed his distress. "What troubles you so?" she asked, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I heard something at the Sullivans today," Thomas whispered, "something that ain't right." The following morning, Thomas Miller made his way to the sheriff's office, his weathered hands trembling as he removed his hat. Sheriff Smith looked up from his desk, noting the farmer's ashen face. "I heard wailing, Sheriff, coming from beneath the floorboards at the Sullivan place," Thomas said, his voice barely audible, "like souls in torment. And it ain't the first time strange sounds have come from that property." The sheriff's pen stopped mid-sentence. "That's a serious claim against respected folks." "Thomas, I know what I heard," the farmer insisted, meeting Smith's gaze, "and I can't live with myself if I say nothing, not after that Garcia girl." Sheriff Smith felt the weight of the farmer's words settle in his chest. The tranquility of Millbrook, perhaps merely an illusion all along, was about to shatter like fine china dropped on stone. Sheriff John Smith approached the Sullivan family's imposing farmhouse with a knot in his stomach. The white-columned porch, meticulously swept, seemed to mock his suspicions with its pristine appearance. Constance Sullivan greeted him at the door, her smile practiced and unwavering, eyes calculating beneath her lace bonnet. "What a pleasant surprise, Sheriff. Do come in for some tea," she offered, ushering him into a parlour that smelled of lemon polish and something else, something acrid that lingered beneath the surface. The sheriff declined refreshments, explaining he needed to review the family's records following reports of unusual activity. Constance's smile never faltered as she produced several leather-bound ledgers, each page filled with elegant script. "Our household accounts are in perfect order," she assured him, her fingers tracing the columns of numbers. "We've nothing to hide." But as Smith examined the documents, inconsistencies emerged like splinters from smooth wood. The quantities of flour, meat, and medicine purchased monthly far exceeded what a family of 5 would consume. When questioned, Constance offered vague explanations about charity work and donations to needy families, all undocumented, all impossible to verify. "And these medicines?" he asked, pointing to regular purchases of laudanum and sleeping draughts. "My husband suffers terrible headaches," she replied, though Smith had never heard of such ailments from the robust patriarch. As he left, the sheriff noticed a heavy iron lock on what appeared to be a kitchen pantry door, unusual security for preserves and dried goods. The floorboards in that corner seemed newer than the rest, hastily replaced. Rain pounded Millbrook that evening, turning dirt roads to mud as Smith returned with Reverend Michael Brown and Dr. William Davis. The physician had treated most townspeople for years, yet had never been summoned to the Sullivan home for any serious illness. "I pray we're mistaken," the Reverend whispered as they approached the darkened house. Using his authority, Smith demanded entry. They found the kitchen empty, the family mysteriously absent despite the late hour and terrible weather. The sheriff moved directly to the locked pantry, breaking it open with determined strikes from his boot. Inside was no pantry at all, but a small room with a rusted iron ring set into the floorboards. The 3 men exchanged grim glances before Smith heaved the trapdoor open. The hinges protested with an unholy shriek that seemed to echo their horror. A gust of fetid air rushed upward, the unmistakable stench of unwashed bodies, human waste, and despair. The doctor covered his mouth, gagging slightly. Reverend Brown's face drained of color as he clutched his Bible tighter. "Dear God," the sheriff whispered, lowering his lantern into the yawning darkness. "What have they done?" The stench hit them first, a nauseating mixture of human waste, sweat, and despair that made Sheriff John Smith recoil. As his lantern illuminated the darkness, the full horror of what lay beneath the Sullivan family's pristine farmhouse came into focus. 47 children were crammed into a space never meant to hold more than farm tools and preserves. Their skeletal frames, barely covered by tattered clothing, were linked together by crude iron chains that had rubbed their ankles and wrists raw. "Dear God," whispered Reverend Brown, his voice breaking as he clutched his Bible tighter. The children's reactions varied in their terror. Some began to weep silently, tears cutting clean paths down dirt-streaked faces. Others remained motionless, their hollow eyes reflecting the lantern light with an emptiness that chilled Smith to his core. A few cowered further into the shadows, as if the promise of rescue was merely another cruel trick. Dr. William Davis pushed past, medical bag in hand, his professional demeanor crumbling as he knelt beside a small boy who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The physician's hands trembled as he attempted to examine the child, who flinched at every movement. "They're malnourished, dehydrated," he muttered, his clinical assessment at odds with the horror in his eyes. "Some show signs of prolonged physical abuse." Sheriff Smith's attention was drawn to a wooden barrel in the corner. Atop it sat a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed and dog-eared from frequent handling. With gloved hands, he opened it, revealing meticulous handwriting that documented the children's existence as if they were livestock. Names, ages, dates of acquisition, physical descriptions, notes about temperament and trainability, chilling entries about obedience levels, and cryptic references to final destinations, with prices listed beside each child. The sheriff's stomach lurched as he recognized some of the names. Children reported missing from neighboring counties, some from as far away as Pennsylvania. Each entry represented a life stolen, a family destroyed, a community that had failed to protect its most vulnerable. Among the huddled masses, a girl slightly older than the others caught his eye. Rebecca Lopez, according to the ledger, had been there longer than most. Despite her emaciated frame, there was a defiant spark in her gaze that hadn't yet been extinguished. "There are more," she whispered hoarsely when their eyes met, "not just here." John Smith's world tilted beneath him. The respected Sullivan family, pillars of Millbrook society, had been operating a human trafficking operation right under their noses. And every entry in that damning ledger represented a cry for help that had gone unanswered for years. The children huddled together in the dim light, their emaciated frames casting elongated shadows against the damp cellar walls. Sheriff John Smith extended his hand toward a small boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old, but the child recoiled, pressing himself against the wall until his spine seemed to bend with the effort. Most of them spoke no English, their terrified eyes conveying what words could not. "It's all right now," the sheriff said softly, his voice cracking. "You're safe." His words fell into emptiness. The children regarded him with vacant stares, as if the concept of safety had been beaten out of them long ago. Dr. William Davis moved cautiously among them, his medical bag open as he assessed their condition. The physician's hands trembled slightly as he documented bruises, malnutrition, and signs of prolonged confinement. "Some have been here for years," Davis whispered, his professional demeanor crumbling as he examined a girl with festering sores where iron shackles had cut into her ankles. "They've been conditioned to fear outsiders." Reverend Brown stood frozen at the foot of the stairs, his Bible clutched to his chest like a shield. The holy man's face had drained of color, his faith visibly shaken by the scene before him. In the far corner, a young woman with dark hair and hollow cheeks watched the proceedings with a different kind of awareness. While the others cowered, she observed, calculating. Sheriff Smith noticed her immediately, the only one who met his gaze directly. "Rebecca Lopez," she said in a hoarse whisper when he approached, offering her name before he could ask. Her English was halting but clear. The sheriff knelt beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Can you tell me how long you've been here, Rebecca?" She held up 3 fingers, then pointed to the changing seasons scratched crudely on the wall behind her. 3 years marked in desperate tallies. "The Sullivans," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the trapdoor above. "They have more places, more children." Her voice dropped even lower. "This is not the only farm." Smith felt ice spread through his veins. "Other properties?" "Where?" Rebecca's eyes darted to the other children, then back to the sheriff. "They talk when they think we don't understand. Richmond, Charlottesville." She swallowed hard. "They sell us." The sheriff exchanged a grave look with Dr. Davis. What they had uncovered wasn't just a single family's depravity. It was the edge of something far more extensive, a network that reached beyond Millbrook's quiet boundaries. Rebecca clutched Smith's sleeve suddenly. "You won't send us back?" The question carried the weight of years of betrayal. "Never," he promised, the single word feeling wholly inadequate against the horror they'd endured. Word of the horrific discovery beneath the Johnson farm spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By Sunday morning, the town had fractured into two opposing camps, with neighbours who'd shared pews for decades now refusing to meet each other's eyes. Sarah Miller, Thomas's wife, stood on the steps of the general store, her voice carrying across the town square as she rallied a group of outraged citizens. 47 children! She cried, her hands trembling with fury. 47 innocent souls chained like animals while we turned a blind eye. The Johnsons must hang for this barbarity. Across the street, a smaller but equally passionate group gathered around Harold Johnson, Constance's brother-in-law. "My family has been pillars of this community for 3 generations, he insisted, his face flushed with indignation. "This is clearly a misunderstanding. Perhaps they were protecting these unfortunate children from something worse." The division cut through families and friendships alike. At the Mercantile, 2 farmers nearly came to blows over a casual comment about the case. Sheriff Smith watched the growing unrest with mounting concern, knowing that justice would be difficult to achieve in such a polarized climate. Meanwhile, Reverend Michael Brown locked himself in the church study, surrounded by years of sermon notes and correspondence with the Johnson family. The respected clergyman's hands shook as he compared his own handwriting to the adoption papers Constance had shown him months earlier when questions about the children were first raised. The similarity was undeniable. Someone had meticulously copied his penmanship, borrowing phrases from his Easter sermon to craft documents that legitimized the presence of foreign children on the Johnson property. The realization struck him like a physical blow. His own words had been weaponized to perpetuate suffering. When Dr. Davis found him there the following morning, the Reverend was still at his desk, eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness and weeping. "I vouched for them," Michael whispered. Pushing the papers toward the physician, "I assured the town these children were being cared for. I silenced doubts with my authority as a man of God." William placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "We all failed them, Michael, every one of us." In the days that followed, Reverend Brown would stand before his divided congregation and confess his unwitting role in the deception. Some would forgive him, others would never return to his church. But it was his daughter Claire who perhaps judged him most harshly, her young face a mirror reflecting back his complicity in what would become known as the darkest chapter in Millbrook's history. The courtroom fell silent as Martha Adams collapsed to her knees, her trembling hands reaching toward the small girl with auburn hair. Lucy Adams, no more than 7 years old, stared back with vacant eyes that held no recognition of the woman who had given birth to her. "And my baby," Martha whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "They told me you were dead." Sheriff John Smith watched the scene unfold with a heaviness in his chest. For 3 years, Martha had been confined to Westbrook Asylum, deemed insane after insisting her infant daughter had been stolen from her cradle. The doctors had diagnosed her with delusions born of grief, yet here stood living proof of her sanity, her child. One of 47 rescued from beneath the Johnson family farm. "She came to us through proper channels," Constance Johnson had insisted during questioning, producing paperwork that Dr. William Davis now confirmed was expertly forged. As word of Martha's vindication spread through Millbrook, a terrible awakening began. Townsfolk gathered in hushed circles outside the general store, confessing what they had ignored for years. "I heard crying last summer when delivering flour to their kitchen," admitted Thomas Miller, his weathered face lined with shame. "Constance said it was just the wind in the chimney. I believed her because it was easier." Sarah Jenkins, who lived on the neighboring property, recalled the strange shadows she'd seen moving across the Johnson barn at midnight. "I told Reverend Brown once," she confessed, unable to meet his eyes. "Ah," he said, "the Johnsons were doing God's work taking in orphans." The Reverend stood silent, his own guilt a visible weight upon his shoulders. Even Robert Davis, who had only passed through Millbrook briefly, shared how the floorboards had creaked with movement when the family claimed no one was below. "I convinced myself it was just an old house settling," he said, staring at his hands. Each confession built upon the last, creating a tapestry of willful blindness that had allowed such horror to continue unchecked. The respected Johnson name had been an impenetrable shield, deflecting suspicion and silencing questions. Lucy Adams remained silent through it all, her small hand clutched in Rebecca Lopez's protective grip. The oldest survivor understood better than anyone how a community could look away when the truth was too painful to acknowledge. "We heard you sometimes," Rebecca told the gathered townspeople, her voice steady despite her youth. "On Sundays, when you'd walk past after church, we'd scream until our throats bled." That night, Millbrook slept fitfully under a burden of collective shame, the truth now as visible and unavoidable as the Johnson farmhouse itself, standing stark against the Virginia hills, a monument to the darkness that had thrived in their midst while they averted their eyes. Sheriff John Smith's hands trembled as he opened the drawer of the mahogany desk in the upstairs study of the Johnson residence. Inside lay 3 additional leather-bound ledgers, their pages yellowed with age but meticulously maintained. Each volume contained names, dozens upon dozens of children from towns as far as Richmond and even Pennsylvania. "Dear God," he whispered, running his finger down a column of ages, none older than 12, some as young as 3. The sheriff had expected to find evidence of local crimes, but this was something far more sinister. The neat handwriting detailed transactions, locations, and handlers, respected names that made his stomach turn. The Andersons from Charlottesville, the Wilsons from Fairfax, even Judge Harrison from Richmond. "It's a network," he told Dr. William Davis later that evening, spreading the ledgers across the physician's dining table. "They weren't just taking local children. They were trafficking them across state lines." The doctor's face paled as he recognized several names, families he'd dined with, people who had sought his medical expertise for their own children while keeping others in chains. "I treated the Johnsons for years," Davis said, his voice barely audible. "Constance came to me for sleeping draughts, said they were for her insomnia." He closed his eyes. "I never questioned why she needed so many." The physician's hands shook as he leafed through the pages. "This boy, I examined him last summer. Constance claimed he was her nephew visiting from Baltimore." His finger traced the entry. "According to this, he was purchased from a family in North Carolina." For days, Dr. Davis had been wrestling with his indirect complicity. Now, confronted with the extent of the horror, something broke within him. The respected doctor who had once worried about his standing in Millbrook society now found himself transformed by shame and determination. "I'm converting my carriage house," he announced. "The children need proper medical attention, somewhere safe, away from prying eyes." Within 48 hours, Davis had transformed the building behind his home into a recovery ward. He spent every waking moment tending to the freed children, documenting their injuries, and helping Sheriff Smith build a case against not just the Johnsons, but their entire network. "Some will never fully heal," he confided to Smith one evening as they watched Rebecca Lopez gently coaxing a younger child to eat. "But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends," the sheriff nodded, understanding the weight of shared guilt. The ledgers had revealed a truth more monstrous than either man could have imagined, but they had also provided the first real chance at justice. Rebecca Lopez sat on the edge of her narrow bed in Dr. William Davis's spare room, her thin fingers tracing invisible patterns on the quilt. When Sheriff John Smith entered, she didn't look up immediately, but when she did, her eyes held a haunted knowledge that made his stomach clench. "There's another place," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Beneath the barn. That's where they kept the little ones." The sheriff felt his blood run cold. The little ones. The youngest children, the ones who cried too much or wouldn't obey. Rebecca's voice cracked on the last word. "Mrs. Johnson said they needed special attention." By nightfall, Smith had assembled a small team. Dr. Davis insisted on coming, bringing his medical bag and blankets. Reverend Michael Brown joined them, his face ashen with the weight of his complicity. They approached the Johnson barn under cover of darkness, lanterns casting long shadows across the weathered wood. The trap door was hidden beneath mouldy hay bales, its iron ring rusted from disuse. It took 3 men to heave it open. The stench that rose from below made even the hardened sheriff gag, a miasma of human waste, mold, and something worse. "Dear God," whispered the Reverend as Smith descended the crude ladder. Each step into the earth brought new horrors into view. Unlike the main cellar, this space was divided into small compartments. Cages, really, each barely large enough for a child to lie down. The cold, damp walls were marked with tiny scratches, desperate tallies of days or perhaps prayers. "They're empty," Smith called up, his lantern illuminating abandoned shackles sized for the smallest wrists. A child's tattered shoe lay forgotten in the corner, alongside a wooden bowl with teeth marks around its rim. Meanwhile, across town, Constance Johnson had orchestrated her own performance. The matriarch collapsed during questioning, her eyes rolling back dramatically as she crumpled to the courthouse floor. Dr. Thomas Miller, new to town and unaware of the growing evidence, declared her unfit for trial due to feminine hysteria and mental fragility. The courthouse erupted in chaos. Supporters of the Johnson family claimed divine intervention had struck down an innocent woman. Others cried foul, demanding justice continue regardless of her condition. As weeks stretched into months, the town's resolve fractured. Some whispered that perhaps the children had been exaggerating, that conditions couldn't have been as dire as claimed. Others suggested the Johnsons had merely been strict disciplinarians, misunderstood in their methods. Sheriff Smith watched the wavering faith in justice with growing despair. Each night he returned to the evidence, the ledgers, the chains, the tiny shoe from the second cellar, to remind himself that some truths, no matter how monstrous, must be faced. The packed courthouse fell silent as Samuel took the stand. His thin frame seemed to shrink further under the scrutiny of the townsfolk who had gathered for what many called the most significant trial in Millbrook's history. When asked about his time in captivity, the boy's response left the room breathless. "Constance Johnson is my only mother," Samuel declared, his voice surprisingly steady. "She saved me from the streets when nobody wanted me. She gave me food and taught me to read." Sheriff John Smith watched from his position near the judge's bench, his weathered face betraying nothing while his mind raced. The sheriff had spent countless hours with the boy, gently coaxing his story. And now Samuel's words threatened to unravel weeks of careful investigation. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Several of Constance's supporters nodded vigorously, while others exchanged troubled glances. The matriarch herself sat with perfect posture, a slight smile playing at her lips as she gazed at Samuel with what appeared to be maternal affection. "She never hurt me," the boy continued. "The chains were to protect us from running away and getting lost in the woods." Rebecca Lopez, seated beside Claire Brown, gripped the Reverend's daughter's hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. The oldest survivor knew better than anyone how Constance had cultivated dependency in her favorites, offering small kindnesses amidst the horror to ensure their loyalty. Outside the courthouse, the town fractured further. Some declared Samuel's testimony proof of the Johnsons' benevolence, while others insisted the boy had been broken by years of manipulation. The following day brought another bombshell. Dr. William Davis presented evidence that Thomas Brown, the respected owner of the general store, had been supplying large quantities of sedatives to the Johnson household for years. The physician produced receipts and entries from his own medical logs that matched dates in the Johnsons' ledger. "These amounts far exceed any legitimate medical need," he testified, his voice heavy with professional authority. The quantities could only serve to subdue multiple individuals. When confronted, Brown crumbled. "I needed the money," he admitted, avoiding the glares of his neighbors. "Times were hard. I never asked what they were for." His name, carefully recorded in the ledger beside payments for sleeping medicine, shattered the reputation he had built over 20 years in Millbrook. Several women openly wept as they realized the quiet shopkeeper had enabled the suffering of dozens of children. Sheriff Smith watched silently as another pillar of the community fell. The case was exposing rot that ran deeper than anyone had imagined, touching lives and livelihoods far beyond the Johnson farm. The courthouse fire started just after midnight. Sheriff John Smith received the news as he paced his empty home, the silence a constant reminder of his wife's departure. By the time he arrived, smoke billowed from the building's east wing, where evidence was stored. The ledgers detailing the Johnson family's activities, crucial documentation for the upcoming trial, had been reduced to ash. "This wasn't accidental," Smith told Dr. Davis the following morning. The physician nodded grimly as he examined a young boy rescued from the Johnson farm. The child flinched at every sudden movement, a testament to months of mistreatment. "3 witnesses have withdrawn their testimonies," the sheriff continued, his voice low. "Thomas Miller found his barn burned to the ground yesterday. The message was clear enough." Anonymous letters appeared on doorsteps throughout Millbrook. Some contained biblical passages about forgiveness. Others held more direct threats. When the court clerk's horse was found slaughtered behind his home, panic spread through the town like wildfire. "They're trying to bury the truth," Reverend Brown whispered during an impromptu meeting in Dr. Davis's office. The Reverend's face had grown gaunt, his shoulders hunched with the weight of his unwitting complicity. "I recommended families to the Johnsons for years. God help me." Rebecca Lopez sat quietly in the corner, her dark eyes taking in everything. At 18, she had become the unofficial spokesperson for the younger children, many of whom still refused to speak. "There are people in town who know more than they're saying," she finally offered. "Samuel isn't the only one who was conditioned to protect them." The sheriff rubbed his temples. "We need to move the remaining evidence somewhere secure. And the children, they're still in danger." Dr. Davis leaned forward. "My sister has a property near Richmond, remote, defensible. I'll arrange transportation," the Reverend said, newfound purpose straightening his spine. "And I'll speak to Claire about accompanying them." That night, as Smith escorted Rebecca back to her temporary lodgings, a shot rang out. The bullet splintered the doorframe inches from her head. The sheriff pushed her inside. Drawing his pistol in one fluid motion, no perpetrator was found, but the message was unmistakable. The next morning, Smith discovered his office ransacked, maps marked with the children's safe houses stolen, yet for every setback, their alliance grew stronger. Dr. Davis converted his cellar into a document repository. Reverend Brown's sermons, once focused on forgiveness, now thundered with calls for justice. Rebecca began teaching the younger children to read, her quiet strength a bulwark against their shared trauma. Together, This unlikely coalition stood firm against the invisible forces trying to silence them, determined that the truth about the 47 children would not be buried again. The courthouse square had transformed into a battleground of faith and morality. Dozens of Johnson supporters gathered daily, their handmade banners fluttering in the spring breeze. "God's mercy for God's servants," read one, while another proclaimed, "The innocent shall not be persecuted." These were the same people who had once shared communion bread with Sheriff John Smith, now glaring at him with contempt as he escorted witnesses through their hostile gauntlet. "The Lord sees your treachery, Smith," shouted Thomas Wilson, the blacksmith whose wagon had been repaired countless times by Johnson funds. The sheriff kept his eyes forward, his jaw set against the barrage of accusations. Millbrook's Methodist foundations, once the bedrock of community harmony, now cracked under the weight of divided loyalties. Neighbors who had prayed side by side for decades now crossed the street to avoid each other. The general store became segregated by unspoken agreement. Johnson supporters in the morning, their opponents in the afternoon. Inside the hallowed walls of the church, another struggle unfolded. Claire Brown moved quietly among the rescued children, housed temporarily in the parish hall. Her gentle hands bandaged wounds both visible and hidden as she coaxed shy smiles from traumatized faces. "My father taught me that God's house welcomes all who suffer," she told Rebecca Lopez as they worked together folding donated blankets. "But where was God's welcome when you needed it most?" Rebecca's dark eyes studied the Reverend's daughter. "Perhaps he sent you instead," she replied softly. Claire's faith, once a simple inheritance from her father, had become a complicated personal journey. Each night she questioned Reverend Michael Brown about the church's years of silence. "How could we not have known?" she demanded one evening, her voice echoing in the empty sanctuary. The Johnsons sat in the front pew every Sunday while children suffered beneath their floorboards. The Reverend, his shoulders stooped with the burden of his blindness, could only whisper, "Faith without vigilance becomes complicity, my child." Meanwhile, the Methodist leadership split into factions. Elder James Peterson publicly defended the Johnsons, citing their generous church donations and apparent piety. In response, 3 deacons resigned their positions, refusing to serve alongside defenders of monsters. Sunday services dwindled to half their usual attendance. Those who came sat rigidly separated, Johnson supporters on one side, their opponents on the other, with an empty middle section that spoke volumes about the town's division. "This trial isn't just about the Johnsons anymore," Dr. William Davis remarked to Sheriff Smith as they watched another protest form. "It's about who we are as a community and what we're willing to see or ignore in God's name." Paul Johnson returned to Millbrook after 7 years away, his weathered face lined with new creases that spoke of hard labor in distant towns. The former laborer had heard whispers of the horrors discovered at his family's farm, a property he had once helped maintain with his own calloused hands. Standing before Sheriff John Smith in the cramped courthouse office, Paul's confession poured out like water from a broken dam. "I built those cellars myself, Sheriff," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "The second one beneath the barn, too. Constance told me they needed extra storage for preserves and to shelter livestock during storms." His eyes, red-rimmed and haunted, fixed on the floor. "Never once did I imagine children would be chained down there." The sheriff studied him carefully, noting how Paul's hands trembled as he sketched detailed layouts of the underground chambers. These drawings revealed hidden alcoves and secondary exits, unknown even to the investigation team. His testimony became invaluable, providing context to the cryptic notations in the ledgers about expansion plans and holding capacity. Meanwhile, across town in the modest church annex that now served as temporary housing for the survivors, Rebecca Lopez sat beside Claire Brown on a wooden bench overlooking a small garden. The oldest of the rescued children still flinched at sudden movements, but in Claire's gentle presence, her shoulders gradually relaxed. "I remember counting the floorboards above us," Rebecca said softly, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on her skirt. 47 across, one for each of us. I used to imagine what might be happening in the room above. Claire listened attentively, her father's Bible open but unread on her lap. Unlike Reverend Brown, whose faith had been shaken to its core, his daughter found purpose in these quiet moments. She never pushed for details, but created space for memories to surface naturally. "Samuel used to sing to the younger ones," Rebecca continued, a ghost of a smile crossing her face, "very quietly, so they wouldn't hear upstairs. He knew lullabies in 3 languages. These fragments of recollection, painful as they were, helped Sheriff Smith connect evidence that might otherwise have remained scattered. Through Rebecca's memories and Paul's knowledge of the property, a more complete picture emerged, not just of captivity, but of a systematic operation that had functioned undetected for years. Paul Johnson became a pariah among the remaining Johnson supporters, yet he persisted in his cooperation, driven by the weight of unwitting complicity. Each night he returned to his rented room above the general store, unable to sleep as he imagined children suffering in spaces he had created with his own hands. John Smith returned to an empty house for the 3rd night in a row, the sheriff's modest home, once filled with the scent of fresh bread and his son's laughter, now echoed with silence. He placed his hat on the hook by the door and stared at the letter his wife had left on the kitchen table. "The scandal is too much to bear," she had written. "People whisper when I walk through town. They say you're obsessed, that you're destroying the reputation of good Christian folk." The investigation into the Johnson family had consumed every waking moment of his life. While most of Millbrook had initially rallied behind the rescue of the 47 children, opinions had shifted as prominent townspeople found their names in the ledgers. The sheriff's determination to follow every lead, regardless of social standing, had made him powerful enemies. His son, barely 12 years old, had been removed from the schoolhouse after the teacher claimed his presence was disruptive to learning. In truth, the teacher's brother-in-law was among those implicated in the trafficking network. Smith poured himself a small measure of whiskey and unfolded a crumpled note that Rebecca Lopez had written him. The young woman's handwriting was improving daily as she worked with Claire Brown. "We remember your kindness," she had written. "The children ask for you." These small gestures kept him going when everything else crumbled around him. The previous Sunday, half the congregation had turned their backs when he entered the church. Reverend Brown, standing firm despite his own crisis of faith, had preached about moral courage while meeting the sheriff's eyes across the pews. Dr. Davis had become his most steadfast ally, visiting each evening with updates on the children's health and offering quiet companionship. "My wife thinks I've lost my mind too," the doctor had confessed, "but I cannot unsee what we found beneath those floorboards." Sleep came rarely to Smith now. When exhaustion finally claimed him, his dreams were filled with small, desperate faces and the sound of chains dragging across dirt floors. He would wake gasping, reaching for the comfort of his wife, only to find cold sheets beside him. Yet each morning he pinned his badge to his chest and continued his work. The ledgers revealed connections to families in 3 neighboring counties. Each entry represented a child stolen from their home, their future, their very humanity. "Every small victory," he whispered to himself as he reviewed his notes by lamplight, "comes at great personal cost." But the alternative, allowing such evil to continue unchecked, was unthinkable. As dawn broke over Millbrook, Sheriff Smith straightened his shoulders and prepared to face another day of isolation. Resistance and the slow, painful pursuit of justice. The trial of Constance Johnson stretched into its third month, a grueling spectacle that tested Millbrook's fragile unity. The courthouse, once a symbol of justice, had become a theater of corruption. Whispers of bribes passing hands in the shadows and witnesses receiving midnight visits from unknown men plagued Sheriff John Smith's investigation. "Another delay," muttered the sheriff, watching as the judge announced yet another postponement. The courtroom had thinned considerably since the proceedings began, many townsfolk unwilling to face the mounting evidence of their collective blindness. Constance sat unnaturally still each day, her face a mask of serene indifference. The matriarch's composure never cracked, even as her legal representation crumbled around her. 3 attorneys had already withdrawn from her defense, the latest citing irreconcilable differences after his children reported being followed on their way home from school. "She doesn't even pretend to feel remorse," Dr. William Davis whispered to Reverend Brown as they watched from the gallery. The doctor had aged years in months, his dedication to the rescued children taking a visible toll. The prosecution's case seemed ironclad, yet somehow witnesses faltered on the stand, evidence disappeared, and testimonies contradicted earlier statements. Sheriff Smith knew the Johnson family's influence reached far beyond Millbrook, their wealth buying silence and fabricating doubt. Everything changed the day Rebecca Lopez took the stand. The young woman entered the courtroom with quiet dignity, her eyes briefly meeting Samuel's across the room before focusing on the prosecutor. When asked to recount her experiences, Rebecca spoke with a clarity that silenced even the most skeptical observers. "The ledgers had markings," she explained, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "Stars meant the child was docile. Crosses meant they needed more discipline. Constance taught us to recognize our numbers, not our names." Rebecca detailed the coded language that permeated the Johnson household, how planting season referred to acquiring new children, and harvest meant preparing them for transport elsewhere. She described hidden correspondence about expansion opportunities in neighboring counties, revealing the horrifying scope of the operation. "When visitors came," Rebecca continued, "we were trained to make animal sounds if we heard footsteps above. Constance told people the farm had problems with raccoons in the walls." As she spoke, several jurors openly wept. Even those who had defended the Johnsons found their certainty wavering under the weight of her testimony. Samuel, who had staunchly supported his mother throughout the proceedings, stared at his hands, unable to meet Rebecca's gaze. By the time she stepped down from the witness stand, something fundamental had shifted in the courtroom. The wall of denial that had protected the Johnsons for decades finally began to crumble, brick by painful brick. The midnight bells of Millbrook's church had just struck 12 when 3 masked figures slipped through the shadows toward the jailhouse. Loyal supporters of the Johnson family, they carried a crude map of the building and a set of stolen keys. Their mission was clear: free Constance Johnson before her inevitable conviction. Sheriff John Smith, who had taken to sleeping in his office during the trial, was awakened by the soft scrape of metal against metal. He reached for his pistol, moving silently toward the cell block. The flickering lamp cast long shadows as he spotted the intruders fumbling with Constance's lock. "Step away," he commanded, his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. The tallest intruder turned, revealing himself as Thomas Brown, the general store owner whose reputation had already been tarnished by his connection to the sedatives. "You don't understand, Smith. She's innocent. This town is tearing itself apart over lies." Constance rose from her cot, her eyes gleaming with a strange triumph even in defeat. "My friends still believe in me," she whispered. The confrontation escalated quickly. One man lunged at the sheriff, while another tried to drag Constance toward the exit. In the chaos, a lantern crashed to the floor, flames licking at the wooden boards. The fire spread with frightening speed, forcing everyone to flee into the street. By dawn, half the jailhouse stood charred and smoking. A crowd gathered in the square, divided physically by Main Street, Johnson's supporters on one side, those seeking justice on the other. Words became shouts, shouts became shoves, and soon the town square erupted into violence. Reverend Michael Brown tried to intervene, his voice drowned by angry cries. "We are neighbors," he pleaded, but his words fell on deaf ears. Even his daughter Claire, who had devoted herself to caring for the rescued children, could not bridge the widening gulf between townspeople who had once broken bread together. Sheriff Smith managed to secure Constance in a makeshift cell at the courthouse, but the damage was done. Families who had lived side by side for generations now refused to speak. The general store divided its hours, mornings for Johnson supporters, afternoons for others. As spring progressed into summer, an eerie phenomenon spread across the Johnson property. The cornfields, once the pride of the county, withered despite abundant rain. The apple orchard dropped its fruit unripe and rotten. Even the wildflowers that had always carpeted the hillside refused to bloom. "It's as if the land itself remembers," Dr. William Davis remarked as he rode past with the sheriff. "Nature rejecting what happened there?" Smith nodded silently, watching a flock of birds veer sharply away from the property. Like Millbrook itself, they seemed unable to fly over the farm without being torn in two. The Johnson house stood like a dark monument to Millbrook's shame. Wooden planks now covered windows that had once welcomed guests with warm lamplight. Yellow ribbons declaring "crime scene" fluttered in the Virginia breeze, a stark contrast to the spring flowers beginning to bloom across neighboring properties. Sheriff John Smith had personally hammered the final nail into the front door, sealing away the horrors within, but not the memories that haunted the town. Neighbors who once proudly claimed friendship with the Johnsons now crossed to the opposite side of the dirt road when passing the property. Martha Wilson, who had attended every Sunday service alongside Constance Johnson for 15 years, told anyone who would listen about the unnatural chill that emanated from the grounds. "I always felt something wasn't right," she whispered to fellow churchgoers, conveniently forgetting how she had once praised the family's generosity at town meetings. The property that had once hosted harvest celebrations became the subject of fearful speculation. Children dared each other to touch the fence at dusk. Adults claimed to hear crying on windless nights. The once fertile fields lay fallow, as if the earth itself rejected what had transpired there. Some townsfolk, racked with guilt over their collective blindness, channeled their shame into action. Thomas Miller and his wife Sarah opened their home to two of the youngest survivors, twin girls who barely spoke but whose eyes followed every movement with wary vigilance. Dr. William Davis converted his carriage house into a recovery space, spending hours gently coaxing traumatized children back to health. "We cannot undo what happened," the doctor told Reverend Brown during a particularly difficult night, when one child refused to sleep without chains, too accustomed to their weight. "But we can ensure they know not all adults bring pain." Others in Millbrook could not bear the weight of their complicity. Thomas Brown, the general store owner implicated in supplying sedatives, sold his business under cover of night and departed for Pennsylvania. 3 families who had frequently dined with the Johnsons simply packed their belongings and left without farewell, unwilling to face the questioning glances of their neighbors. The courthouse clerk noted a surge in property sales that spring. "People leaving think they can outrun the shame," Rebecca Lopez observed to Claire Brown as they watched another wagon loaded with furniture roll out of town. "But the children's faces follow you everywhere." For those who remained, The boarded house served as a daily reminder of how easily evil could hide behind respectability and how silence could become complicity. The structure remained standing, not as shelter, but as warning. Sheriff John Smith sat alone on his porch, watching the autumn leaves drift across his yard. The trial had concluded 3 months ago, and while his reputation in Millbrook had been restored, his home remained empty. His wife had taken their son to her sister's place in Richmond, unable to bear the whispers and stares that followed them through town. The weight of the case had carved new lines into his weathered face. At night, he still heard the rattling of chains and saw 47 pairs of frightened eyes looking up from the darkness. Yet each morning he donned his badge and continued his duties with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through the investigation. "You've done this town a service," Dr. Davis had told him yesterday. Clasping his shoulder outside the courthouse, not many men would have stood firm against such opposition. The sheriff merely nodded. He didn't need accolades or recognition. The truth had been his only goal, however painful its revelation. Across town, Rebecca Lopez sat with 3 young survivors, teaching them to read English from a tattered primer. Her own scars, both visible and hidden, remained. But something else had blossomed within her, a fierce determination to help others reclaim their voices. "When I first came out of that cellar," she explained to a visiting state official, "I thought my life was over. Now I understand it was just beginning." Rebecca had declined offers to return to her distant relatives. Millbrook was where her purpose had found her, where her testimony had helped bring justice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. On Sundays, she worked alongside Claire Brown at the small schoolhouse they'd established behind the church. The Reverend's daughter had defied convention by dedicating herself to the children's recovery, her faith transformed rather than broken by the ordeal. The town itself remained divided. Some families had packed their belongings and left, unwilling to live with the shame of their silence. Others stayed, determined to rebuild Millbrook's soul as well as its reputation. Sheriff Smith rarely spoke of the case anymore. When new deputies asked about the Johnson investigation, he would simply direct them to the court records. His actions, the continued vigilance, the monthly inspections of orphanages, the careful scrutiny of traveling families spoke louder than any words could. One evening, as dusk settled over the hills, Rebecca found the sheriff standing at the edge of town, gazing toward the abandoned Johnson property. "Do you think we'll ever truly understand why?" she asked. Smith shook his head slowly. "Some darkness can't be understood, only brought to light." They stood in silence, 2 souls forever changed by what they had witnessed, yet somehow still standing. The Johnson farmhouse stood abandoned for nearly 2 years after the trial concluded. Weeds choked the once pristine cornfields, and locals took long detours to avoid passing the property. In the autumn of 1836, the Virginia state legislature finally approved funds to transform the site into what they called a place of remembrance and vigilance. Sheriff John Smith attended the dedication ceremony but remained at the back of the crowd. The weight of those 47 souls still pressed upon his shoulders. He watched as workers dismantled the house, preserving only the foundation stones as a perimeter for the memorial garden. The cellars were filled with earth and sealed forever. Though many claimed the ground there would never truly heal. "You did what was right," Rebecca Lopez told him that day, her hand briefly touching his arm. Now 21, she had grown into a formidable advocate for orphaned children across Virginia. The young woman's testimony had inspired legislators to draft the Child Protection Act of 1835, establishing regular inspections of orphanages and homes claiming to shelter displaced children. Dr. Davis had converted part of his practice into a sanctuary for the survivors, employing Claire Brown to help with their education and recovery. The physician's dedication to these children became his life's work, a penance he embraced wholeheartedly. "Some wounds never fully heal," William told the sheriff as they stood before the memorial plaque, listing every child's name, "but they can become bearable with time and care." Reverend Brown, his hair now streaked with grey, led a simple prayer at the ceremony. His sermons had changed profoundly since the discovery, focusing less on blind faith and more on community responsibility. The church bell that once called the faithful now rang 47 times each year on the anniversary of the children's liberation. Not everyone embraced the memorial. Thomas Miller reported that some still whispered about the Johnsons being misunderstood, victims of hysteria rather than perpetrators of evil. Constance Johnson had died in prison the previous winter, unrepentant to the end. Samuel, now living with a family in Richmond, still sent flowers to her grave. As dusk fell over the memorial, Sheriff Smith remained alone among the stone markers. He thought of his wife and son, now living in Baltimore, and the personal cost of his unwavering pursuit of justice. Yet he could not bring himself to regret a single day of the investigation. "The name Johnson will serve as a warning," he wrote in his final report to the governor, "that evil often wears the mask of respectability, and that looking away is its greatest ally."